Now, gene flow, also called migration, is the movement of individuals from one population to another. So, for example, I moved from California. So I moved from the California population to the Iowa population. That's a migration, and that's with me. I didn't just take my furniture and my pets and all that, I also took my genes. And so if I were to meet someone here and have offspring here, I would be introducing alleles from California that may not be seen in Iowa. Obviously, with people and globalization, we've already kind of done this. We've kind of created a really wide network in how far people will go and travel. But when we look at organisms like animals and plants that may not travel as far, this can have a pretty significant impact. So this can change the allele frequencies into populations, and gene flow really is influenced by things like mobility. Are you able to move around? Can you travel? So like with humans, we can travel pretty much anywhere. We have planes, we have cars, we have buses, right? We have a lot of ways to move around. Environmental barriers. So let's say we're looking at like squirrels living around the Grand Canyon. You might see a difference in squirrels on the north end versus the south end of the Grand Canyon, simply because they cannot go down the canyon and cross it and come back up the other side. So that would be an environmental barrier where they just cannot get from one side of the canyon to the other. Or it could be a lake or a river or an ocean, right? And then human activity, what are we doing? Are we moving things around for them? That's something we've done when it comes to shipping. We've accidentally moved like plants or animals around that way. So there's plenty of ways for genes and alleles to basically get around from one population to another. And then the last thing that we're going to look at is natural selection, and this is where Charles Darwin comes in, right? Remember that evolution was not a new idea with Charles Darwin. His new idea, his contribution was the mechanism, or one of the mechanisms behind it being natural selection. And in order for natural selection to happen, he noted that you had to have these three particular conditions. You have to have variation. So basically, you cannot all be clones of each other. You have to have differences in a trait. So it doesn't matter what trait we're looking at, but if you're looking at a particular trait and you want to see natural selection act on that trait, you have to have individuals who are different from each other with that trait. So skin color, eye color, hair color, so on and so forth. And that variation has to be genetic. So it has to be inherited. So the variation has to exist. The variation has to be inherited. And the variation has to lead to some differences in how well they reproduce. So it's important to note why does that happen? Why do some individuals reproduce more or do better than others? And in order to recognize that, we have to recognize kind of another part of natural selection, and that is competition. So when we say competition, we mean that the resources we use, water, food, mates, shelter, all those types of things, are limited. So since the resources are limited, you can only capture so much. And the better you are at capturing those resources, the better your reproductive success can be. So if you have traits that allow you to capture those resources, whether it's mates or food or shelter, whatever it is that gives you an advantage at doing those things and reproducing, you're going to do better. And there will be individuals who don't have as good of reproductive success because they can't capture those. The resources are limited within a population, and what will happen is that basically a population will grow until it meets the capacity for that environment and the resources available. And that's when we start to see that reproductive success really kind of, the differences in that reproductive success really kind of anchor in. Now, when it comes to mating success, finding a mate with natural selection, we call that sexual selection. So for example, with peacocks, it's a really kind of over-the-top example, but with peacocks, if you're a male peacock and you're trying to find a mate, you have to have the really big showy feathers, and if you don't, you're probably not going to find a mate. If you do, you've successfully mated, that you were chosen because the female thought you were attractive, right? So that would be sexual selection. But there's reasons behind that, right? Why does she think it's attractive? Maybe because it's really hard to get the resources to have feathers like that. And if you don't have feathers like that, maybe it's an indicator you don't have as high quality food or good access to food and whatnot. So there's those things. This includes the physical, the behavioral traits that increase reproductive success. So are you able to attract a mate through dance or song? Maybe there's parental traits. The fact that you're going to even help raise the offspring is attractive to the mate. There's a lot of things that can go into it. Or just the fact that you help with the offspring means that they're more likely to survive, right? There's a lot of things, a lot of different traits that can increase reproductive success. But we don't want to focus on who's the top dog and who's the bottom. We don't want to focus on winners and losers. Mainly we want to focus on just the losers. So the reason being is that for the most part, in order to, quote, win the evolutionary race, you have to be just good enough. Imagine like if you're running a race and instead of us worrying about who's in first place, we worried about who finished the race in the first place. Like who even just made it across the finish line versus those who never crossed the finish line at all. So when we're looking at evolution, we're kind of looking at those who did not cross the finish line because those are the ones that are going to die out and disappear. Natural selection is more about the elimination of traits rather than the increase of the selection of the winners, so to speak. Because again, if you are not reproductively successful, if you're not having offspring, you're basically the end of your family tree, right? You're the end of the line. The traits that you have die with you. So we're focused on those who do not capture the resources they need, who do not capture the mates they need, and do not reproduce successfully. So we have the variation. We need variation. In this case, we see 5 different colors. They need to be inherited. Because there is limited resources and individuals must compete for those resources, we see differential reproductive success. And so we see in this case, blue did really well, green did well, teal did all right, yellow did okay, but purple's not doing so hot. So in this case, we would focus on purple because purple is at risk of completely disappearing due to natural selection. Now, we had mentioned the word fitness a few times, and I know I had talked about it a handful of times, but I'm going to do it again because, again, this is a common misconception with students is that fitness means bigger, faster, stronger. It does not. Fitness is basically how successful are you, right, versus everyone else. So you're comparing yourself to the others in the population. Are you a better fit? Are you having more offspring than others? But fitness depends on the current conditions. So, for example, if we are looking at mice living on rocks and dirt, and the dirt is very light, like a light brown, mice that have a light brown fur color are probably going to do better because they can camouflage. They're not going to be picked off by predators as easily, which means they live longer and they can have more babies. But if something happens and maybe like a fire burns through or lava flows through and now the rocks are all dark, like they're really like almost black, then having light brown fur is a problem. And anyone who has darker fur now has the benefit, right? They're going to be a better fit for the environment. And so they'll live longer and they'll have more babies. So it depends on the current conditions. So rather than saying survival of the fittest, it's more of like survival of what works right now. So we're looking at the ability to fit in with the surroundings. Do we have traits that allow us to do well in the current conditions? And this is why if you suddenly change the environment or if you take an organism from one environment and you put it in another, they tend to have problems, right? It's really hard for an organism to kind of get introduced into brand new environments that are not like the ones they came from, simply because they're a good fit for those conditions. not the new conditions. But if they do survive long enough and they're able to reproduce, you might see a shift where each generation gets a little bit better fit for those new conditions we put them in. So natural selection in nature. Let's say we're looking at speed in rabbits. Now, speed in rabbits would be beneficial because you can get away from predators. So we see that some rabbits are faster than others. There's our variation. And that there's something related to genes that gives them the speed. So it's inherited. So the slow rabbits have slow babies. The fast rabbits have fast babies. And the rabbits who are slower they're getting eaten by this fox, and so they're less likely to survive and reproduce and have lots of babies, versus the fast ones. They can escape the fox, which means they have a longer lifespan, they have more time to have more babies, and those babies are also going to be fast. And then, like I said, with the mice, if you have a light background, then the mice with the light fur are going to do well because they blend in, versus the darker mouse here, which is seen by predators and gets picked off. And if we change the background to a darker background, now suddenly the darker mice have the advantage, the lighter mice get picked off really easy. And so we see the shift in the allele frequency. Now, these inherited traits that give you an advantage, right? The change in that is what we call adaptation. So the process of becoming a better match to the environment, we would say that the population is adapting to the environment. And then an adaptation itself is like, what's the trait that actually helps? So in the case of looking at these mice, we would say that the darker fur here is an adaptation and lighter fur would not be, because the darker fur gives an advantage on this dark background. Moving on to this next point, it's important to note there's no such thing as a perfect organism, because the environment is always changing, and so the traits that become favorable will also change. So who's successful and who's not will change in accordance with the environmental conditions. And that in order to become successful, you can only work with what you have, right? You can only work with the alleles that are present in the population. So, for example, we are upright humans, right? We walk on two legs, and we have babies with really large heads, right? In a perfect human organism, we would have much wider hips. We would have different hips, right? A different structure to our hips to make childbirth easier, right? Our childbirth is, comparatively speaking, way worse than other animals, for the most part. In a perfect organism, like in a perfect human, we wouldn't have that problem, but we're not perfect, right? No organism is. It's also important to remember from like the first video we did is that there's no end goal in evolution except to basically survive, right? It is a day-to-day process. We are trying to survive from today to the next day. We're trying to survive from one generation to the next generation. But there's no end goal. There's no like, we want to make an organism that looks and acts like this, right? So we can't predict the future necessarily. The evolution itself is not trying to work towards some sort of organism outcome. And so we see that traits can fluctuate based on the conditions that we see in a given time period. And if they change, then we see traits will change along with it. One of the really good examples of that is the Galapagos finches. We're coming back to these guys. These guys were studied for a long time, about 40 years, where we looked at their food supply and beak size based off of the rainfall, the average rainfall for the years. And so with this study, we see that we're going through time. We are looking at how much rainfall there was, which is going to affect the food source in the average beak size. So we see that when we have droughts, when it's dry, we see that the beak size got larger. And when it was a wet year, then the beak size tended to shrink. And the reason being is that in the dry years, finches had to eat the large hard seeds. And so a bigger beak was helpful if you had to eat large hard seeds, because the big beak could grasp these seeds, break them open, and get the yummy contents. In the wet years, though, smaller seeds that are softer and easier to eat with smaller beaks came into, I guess you say, fashion, right? Were more popular or more common is a better way to put it. So in the wet years, smaller seeds became more common, and so if you had a small beak, you got more food. So that's how we saw this change in beak size. Not necessarily massive changes, we're looking at millimeters here, but we did record changes that fluctuated right alongside the environment. So as the weather fluctuated, drought versus wet years. As the weather fluctuated, we saw that the seeds available fluctuated. So droughts brought along large, hard seeds. Wet years brought along small, soft seeds. And the animals eating these seeds responded accordingly. Again, we're not saying that individuals saw changes in their beak size. We just saw that the individuals with bigger beaks did better in droughts, and the individuals with smaller beaks did better in wet years. Now, I mentioned it briefly at the kind of towards the beginning of this video, alongside with natural selection is also artificial selection. This is another process of change and of evolution, but we're focused on how humans influence that evolution. And typically, the process is predetermined. There is a specific goal in mind with artificial selection because humans are trying to achieve something. So for example, crops, dogs, these are both organisms that were bred with a particular end goal in mind. So we look at like corn. The corn you know today did not exist a long time ago until humans got their hands on it, and we started picking the ears of corn that were the biggest and the juiciest, and we would breed those and plant those seeds. And then we would throw out all the rest. And so then the next crop would be bigger and juicier, and we'd pick the biggest and juiciest from that season, throw all the other seeds away, keep the big juicy ones, plant those. And so after every single season, we would get bigger, juicier corn. Same thing with dogs. We want to have a certain trait. We want them to be small. We want them to be large. We want them to have certain colors or types of fur. We would breed them until we would get that trait we wanted every time. So we can also do this in nature. If we look at, for example, if we look at the Tibetan snow lotus flowers, humans were taking the largest ones from the tallest plants. And so the large, tall ones never got to really reproduce well, which meant the plants are getting smaller and smaller because the small plants are the only ones left in order to reproduce because we've taken all the large ones out. So it's not just things like farming and things like pets that are under artificial selection. It's basically any organism where humans are selectively choosing either individuals to breed or individuals to remove. And by doing that, we are influencing who's left to reproduce, right? Who's going to reproduce in that population. Now, natural selection, we've kind of talked about it in a simplified way, but it can select for complex structures and behaviors. Because remember, the only things that we need for natural selection to happen is the trait has to be variable. So individuals have to be a little bit different from each other for that trait. There has to be variation. It has to be an inherited variation. And it has to lead to some individuals reproducing more often than others. And so it's not just physical traits, but also behavioral traits. So for example, if providing parental care to your offspring leads to more offspring surviving and reproducing themselves, that could be a behavioral characteristic that's selected for, right? It's a helpful trait to raise your offspring. And so you might see that become more common, right? So an interesting kind of look at natural selection, the different processes that lead to change. Again, we're just simply looking at change over time. We looked at a few of the mechanisms behind how that change can happen, right? But we're not explaining anything about whys. We're not explaining anything about larger kind of existential questions. We're just looking at what are the observable things that are happening around us when it comes to change in plants, animals, bacteria, so on and so forth.